Hi and welcome to this series of videos on writing and writing advice aimed particularly at writers in the science fiction and fantasy genres. I figured a good topic to start with was prologues. Now, I've come across advice a number of times around never writing prologues. Now, I'm usually sceptical of any sort of writing advice that starts with "you should never do this, you should never write this, you should never tell a story in this way," because generally speaking, for any of those "you should never" rules, you will be able to find an example of a book where the author has broken that rule and done it extremely well. But in the case of prologues, let's look at maybe some of the reasoning behind why people advise you to steer clear of prologues, but also some of the ways you can make prologues work. Now, I think one of the main culprits behind the "you should never write a prologue" rule is this book. The Lord of the Rings, J.R.R. Tolkien, one of the classics of the fantasy genre and used sometimes as almost a blueprint of how to write the sort of the heroic quest narrative. There are a lot of people over the years who have tried to imitate the style of story that worked really, really well in The Lord of the Rings. But that can cause a problem when you try and imitate the things that it might not necessarily do as well as others. So I've bookmarked a page in here, which is in fact the start of the main story of the Fellowship of the Ring. But in front of that, there is a whole bunch of stuff. So in this particular edition, we have introductions to the text, introductions to this edition of the text, and about 20 pages. There's a good chunk of the book there that is this prologue, which introduces the Shire, it introduces hobbits, a bit about their history, it talks about the ring and how that came into the hands of Bilbo. And the problem with this is it's completely unnecessary. We have 20 pages of stuff that doesn't need to be there. We get introduced to the hobbits in the early chapters of the books. We get to know that they love pipeweed from the fact that they're always smoking it. We don't need to have a section in the prologue that talks about the fact that hobbits really like pipeweed. I've met a few people who say that they've tried to read The Lord of the Rings and they couldn't even make it past the prologue. I've seen other people say, hey, if you're going to read Lord of the Rings, just skip the prologue. And that, I think, is the problem. And where a lot of this "don't write a prologue" advice comes from. Because if you're starting your book with 20 pages of unnecessary background that people can just cheerfully say, hey, just skip that bit, you've actually got a problem. When you're writing a book, you want to get into the story, you want to get to the inciting event, you want to introduce your main characters, you want to have your plot hooks, you want to grab the reader's attention and get them interested in the story so they'll keep turning the pages. That's not necessarily going to happen if you start with a long ramble around where one of the cultures in your books comes from. So that, I think, is where we see this advice coming from, and that is something to bear in mind when you're writing your own books, is make sure you're not starting the book with something that people will want to skip. So let's talk about where prologues can work really, really well. And there's a couple of examples I want to talk about, also from big name writers who you've hopefully heard of. And one of those is A Song of Ice and Fire by George R.R. Martin. These books start with prologues. They break the rule and they introduce characters who usually die at the end of the prologue. They are not the main characters of the book, but they give us an insight into things that are going on, particularly the threats. So the first book, A Game of Thrones, starts with a group of characters above the wall up in the north, and they encounter the White Walkers. So the White Walkers are they're sort of the threat in the background for a lot of the early books. So the main characters are off in the south dealing with treason and coups and potentially people not fathering the children that they should have done or that people think are their heirs, and there's a whole bunch of politics going on, lots of infighting, and really that everybody's obsessed with all of that, but as the reader, we are aware that there is this other threat going on. We know that the White Walkers are coming. We know that there's this other danger. And we see people ignore the warnings. They're not spending the money to repair the wall. They're not sending the people north to defend the boundary. We see this challenge. We see the threat, we know that it's there, we've seen it in this opening section, and we're given this insight that isn't really real or doesn't really strike home for the main characters of the book. So we get this knowledge of jeopardy that drives us on to read the story. Another example that I think works quite well is Patrick Rothfuss, and in the name of the Wind. So the framing device for this narrative is a guy telling his life story. So the story opens years in the future. Somebody comes in, recognises the main character. They have a bit of discussion, and the guy agrees that he will tell his story. So the main character is introduced, we know that he is telling his story and maybe he's glossing over some bits, he may not be entirely honest. We get this introduction to the unreliable narrator. He is telling his story and wanting to be good. But we also get these little teasers about some of the events in the book. He makes a comment about being expelled from a university or slaying demons, and we get these hints of events that are going to come over the series of the books. So it's giving us this little teaser trailer of, hey, these are the exciting stories to come, which, given how long the books are, is not necessarily a bad thing for keeping us interested, because we want to know the stories behind those little hints we get at the beginning. There are other ways that prologues can work. So you can have a section told from a different perspective. So as in Game of Thrones, you have somebody who isn't a main character telling part of the story. They can be a different time period. So the flash forward in Name of the Wind, or flashbacks. So I've seen a story that opened with a guy taking over a country, but then the main narrative is about the people trying to get the country back from him. So there's this little flashback at the start. So prologues can work quite well when you want to give this information to the reader that sits outside of the normal narrative, either because it's from a different point of view or because it's in a different time, it doesn't quite fit with the main structure of the story. Another idea when it comes to writing a prologue and getting around this idea that you shouldn't ever write a prologue is actually just not call it a prologue. I would argue that the first chapters of some of the Harry Potter books are actually prologues. They follow the guidelines that I mention around how to make a good prologue. You have sections told from a different point of view. So most of the books for most of the series, the perspective character is Harry. We see the wizarding world through Harry's eyes. But some of the first chapters, we see a different perspective. So we are introduced to the events that happened at the Riddle House, or we see Snape making an unbreakable vow. We see events that Harry is not necessarily physically there for. So we get these sections that introduce the story, that set up ideas, that draw us in, but they are still part of the story. And actually, if we look at the first chapter of the first book, it starts with the Dursleys, and then we're introduced to McGonagall and Dumbledore. Harry himself doesn't actually show up until right near the end of that first chapter, and when he does, he's a sleeping baby. He's not conscious or aware of any of the stuff that is going on in the first chapter. But we as a reader get introduced to the story and the wizarding world and the magic and Voldemort and this background of stuff that Harry won't find out for several chapters. So we get more of an insight into the world. It also is set in a different time. So we get this big jump of about 10 years between chapter 1 and chapter 2. I would say that that first chapter is definitely a prologue, but because it's called chapter 1, you don't get people thinking, oh, I can just skip this, because it's not. It's part of the story, it's important. It matters as much as the rest of the book, and it's written in a way that is humorous. You don't feel the urge to skip it because it's enjoyable. And I think that is the key thing. If you are writing a prologue for your stories, for your books, they should be enjoyable. They should be interesting. They should provide some insight or background or piece of information which is not skippable. So you want to have the story such that people can't just jump past this and they'll be absolutely fine. By all means, write prologues. I have no problem with that, and there are plenty of books out there that have done really well that have prologues. But if you are going to write a prologue, make sure that it does add something to your story. So that was my first video in this series. I'm new to this, so if you do have any advice on how I could do things better or things I could do to improve, please let me know. But also, if you have any ideas of topics you would like to see me discuss, other subjects you think we could go into, please leave a message in the comments, and like and subscribe if you want to see more. Thank you, and see you next time.